Hey everyone, Andrew here. This video is a bit of a follow-up to a previous tutorial where I showed how to get Google Maps and geolocation added into a Vue app. I'll instead be using the same Vue component package to create a map that's populated with pinpoints from a Laravel API. What we're going to be creating should look similar to this, found on a local restaurant's locations page. A variety of pins, and if we click on one, it shows an information box with hours, location, and other relevant data. We're going to be using the Laravel PHP framework to store and request this data. However, if you already have an API system built or prefer using an alternative framework, you can skip directly to the map making portion of this video by using the time link in the description. To get started, I have this blank Laravel project. I'm only going to need one database table and model for this API, restaurants. We can use the artisan make model command with the migration flag to create our restaurant model and migration at the same time. Let's open up the migration file and scaffold out our database table. We'll need a name for our restaurant, an address, a city, a state, and some hours. We'll also need to store the location data as a latitude and longitude. From a variety of sources online, the best structure for these values seems to be a decimal, 8 total numbers with 6 decimal places for the latitude, and 9 total numbers with 6 decimal places for the longitude. Let's run the migration with Artisan to generate our database. We can view our database and see that the structure has been added in. We have a restaurants table with all of our columns ready to store data. Next, I'd like to add just a few test restaurants to our app. We could just add them in right here in our GUI, but I'd like to instead seed the database programmatically. In the console, we can use the artisan make seeder command along with a class name to bootstrap a database seeder. Let's open that up, and under this run command is where we're going to perform our database actions. I'll just add in the DB facade, and then start working on saving a test item into our restaurants table using db table insert. Here we'll add a name, address, city, state, hours, and some latitude and longitude points that I'm pulling from a map. Once we have that one item filled out, we can just copy and paste these 2 more times, changing out some of the values. Perfect. Now, to ensure this runs, we'll have to edit our database seeder class. Under its run method, we'll need to use this, call, and pass in our restaurant seeder class. Then, to actually run it and seed our database, all we need to do is call artisan db seed. Uh-oh, this error popped up. If you see this, all that means is we need to run composer dump autoload first. Okay, let's try running that artisan db seed command again. It went through just as planned. and if we take a look at our database, we can see the 3 test restaurants have been added into the appropriate table. It does seem like these are missing the timestamp values though, and I'll just add those in here now. I'll also adjust the seeder class so that they aren't missing if we need to run this again in the future. So, we have our data saved in the database. Now we need to talk about how we're going to retrieve it. Let's open up the routes API file and get rid of everything that's in there. We just need one route for this demo, which will return all of the restaurants in the database. I'm going to creatively call this restaurants, and it will call the restaurant controller's index method. We can make that controller with the artisan command. Once that's done, let's open it up and add in our method. Public function index, and we're just simply returning restaurant all. Opening up our browser again and navigating to API restaurants, we can see our 3 restaurants and their details returned to us in JSON. That's exactly what we're after. Now that we have our backend API set up, it's time to shift attention toward putting it to use in a front-end view. For this demo, I'm just going to copy the default welcome.blade.php template and call it app.blade.php. Let's change out the title and clean up some of the CSS and markup that we're not going to use. Finishing up with a simple H2 title, and then changing out the view that's rendered on the landing page. We can see it show up in our browser if we refresh. Let's adjust the body margin a bit though, so there's some spacing. Okay, that looks better. Now, we need to add the actual map in here. To do that, we'll first need to create a Vue app. Laravel used to have a bootstrapped Vue file included, but now that functionality is split out into a separate package. To install that, all we need to do is run composer require Laravel UI in our terminal. And after that completes, run artisan UI vue. This will generate all of the file structure, package requirements, and bootstrap.js files that we need to get started with Vue. Running npm install will install those prerequisites. And we're also going to need to install the Vue Google Maps package, just like we did in the geolocation video that I mentioned earlier. Once that's installed, we can use npm run dev to compile our development assets and get started using them in our app. Before our closing body tag in the app.blade.php file, let's add in the script call to our main app.js file. Opening it up, I'm going to get rid of the comments in here. For simplicity's sake, this is where we're going to be handling our Vue app development. Our front end will be very simple, so we can get away with using a single file instead of breaking it out into individual components. Adding in an ID of app to our map wrapper div completes the Vue installation. If we open up our browser, refresh the page, and open up our dev console with Vue tools installed, we can see that we definitely have a Vue app up and running on this page. This needs a map though, so let's get started with that. Back in our app.js file, we'll need to import everything as Vue Google Maps from Vue to Google Maps and implement it with a vue.use statement, passing in our imported object, along with setting our load key option, which I'm just keeping blank for right now. Back on our app.blade template, adding in the map is pretty straightforward. Using the gmap map element and Vue's dynamic attributes, we'll set the center as an object with a latitude of 10 and a longitude of 10, the zoom as 7, and the style as 100% wide with 320 pixels of height. Actually, scratch that. We'll need to swap the element name out for a lower kebab case, gmap-map. Let's head to our browser and refresh. Our map is displayed. It's covered with a for development purposes only overlay because of that missing key from earlier. But other than that, it's a fully functioning JavaScript embed of a Google map. I'm just going to tweak some styles here to make it a little nicer to work with and look at. That's better. I've also gone ahead and created an API key for this demo, so that the overlay is removed now. If you're unsure of how to do that, the video I've linked below will take you through all of the steps necessary to generate one from the Google Cloud Console. So, now we have our map. It's time to populate it with pins to represent our restaurants. Between the gmap map tags, we can use another view element from the package, gmap marker. This takes a position attribute, and like the center attribute in the map, it's an object with a latitude and longitude. There's also clickable, which we'll set to true. We want these map pins to open up an info window whenever they're clicked. Draggable will be false though. We don't want these to be moved away from the positions that we initially set them in. Refreshing our browser, we'll see this test pin added in the same location as our map center. Clicking it doesn't do anything yet, but we can click on it. And we can't drag it. So it looks like our attributes are all working as expected. Well, this looks good for a test pin, but we need to populate this map based on our database. Since we are in a Laravel view, I could directly include the restaurants as an array, and then loop through a for each creating the gmap marker element for each one. However, because of this front end is using Vue already, and I want this tutorial to be a little bit more decoupled from the back end, we're going to use Vue to populate these pins and treat our data layer as a separate API. In our app.js file, let's create a data object to hold our app's data points. For now, the sole item will be an empty array of restaurants. We'll also add in a created method, fired when the Vue lifecycle starts. That's going to in turn use Axios to perform a GET request on the API restaurants endpoint and pass the return data along to our restaurants array. Any errors will be caught and logged in the browser console. So now, back on our app.blade template, we can use v4 on the gmap marker element. This will create a marker for each item in the restaurants array. Because we're using v4, we'll specify the index as the ID of the restaurant, and then set the location of the point to the latitude and longitude that's stored in the database for that restaurant. Actually, for this right here, we need to specify that these are float values. We could do that inline, but for anything that lengthy, I like splitting it off into its own method. We'll call it getPosition and pass in our restaurant as the only argument. Let's create that method in our app.js file. It's just going to return an object with the latitude and longitude from the restaurant, parsed out as floats. Now if we go back to our browser and refresh, we can zoom out and see our 3 markers being displayed from the data in our database. There's a slight problem though. When we load up the map, the center is very far away from where our points are. Let's fix that. In our app.js file, we're going to create a computed property called mapCenter. Unlike a data point, a computed property is constantly evaluated for a return value that could change depending on the values of other data points. In our case, we want to have the center to be 10 latitude and 10 longitude if there's no restaurants present. But as soon as there are, we want to change it to the latitude and longitude of the first restaurant in the array. Back on our app.blade template file, all we need to do is update our gmap maps center attribute to use the computed map center property. If we save, recompile our dev assets, and refresh the browser, we can see that as soon as the restaurants are retrieved, the map center changes to match the latitude and longitude of the first one returned. Let's adjust the zoom here so it's a little easier to see. 10 should be good. That's much better. And you don't have to use the first element of the array for the map center. You can get the center point for all of them and calculate an average or median value, or form a bounding box based on the largest or smallest ones. For now though, I'm just going to stick with this. Next, I want these markers to open up a pop-up when they're clicked, like this one here. So let's head back to our application. And in our app.blade file, above the gmap marker element, we'll add in a gmap info window component. This handles displaying an info window for our marker, and will pass through some dynamic attributes. Options, set to an info window options data object. Position, set to an info window position data object. And opened, set to an info window opened boolean. Inside this element will be all of the information that we want to display in that pop-up window using plain HTML markup. For now, I'll just hardcode in some test data. A title, some hours, and an address with the city and state. Next, we need to create these attributes in our Vue apps data object. By default, the info window is closed, and we're going to have to move this info window position item to a computed property. We could just update it each time a marker is clicked on, but because we're also going to be dynamically writing text and data to the info box, it makes sense to instead store something like an active restaurant object, and generate the position of the info box from that. Just like the map center position, this is returning an object with latitude and longitude generated from the position of the active restaurant. Now, we'll just add in some options for our info window, an offset of 0 width and a -35 height, which will make the box display a bit more closer to the pin. Next, we need to set this active restaurant object each time that a marker is clicked. Going back to our app.blade template, under the gmap marker element, we can add a click event listener. That will then, in turn, change the active restaurant object to whatever restaurant is associated with the marker that was just clicked. If I build our assets, go to the browser, and refresh, clicking on each marker updates our app's active restaurant data. It might not look like it because we're not doing anything with that information, but if we open up our development console and go to the Vue Dev Tools, we can see those changes happening in real time. Back in the source code, we need to do two things whenever a marker is clicked. Besides updating the active restaurant, we also need to display that info window. I don't like using separate statements inline like this, so let's break this out into a method called handleMarkerClicked, passing through the restaurant as an argument. Now we can create that method in our app.js file and set the active restaurant to the R object passed through. And also set the info window opened boolean to true. We also need to do the reverse of this, handling what happens when an info window is closed. Luckily, Vue Google Maps includes an event listener for that, and we can add close-click to our Gmap info window element. It'll fire off a method called handleInfoWindowClose. Let's go ahead and create that method under our handleMarkerClicked method from just earlier, and it will set the active restaurant to an empty object and set the info window opened property to false. Refreshing the browser yet again, we can click on the markers and see the info box appearing just as expected. We can even close it and open up a different one, seeing the box show up right above the marker it should. It's still showing that hard-coded data though, so let's change that. We already have this active restaurant object, which is a full item from the database, so we can just use its attributes in place of these hard-coded values. The name, hours, address, city, and state of the active restaurant will be displayed in this info window. Let's refresh again and test that out. Perfect. Each restaurant is updating its own info window with the appropriate data. As a quick side mission, what if we wanted to display a new pinpoint whenever a user clicked the map, on the point that they clicked on? Let's try and get that added in. Just like Gmap marker, the Gmap map component has a click event listener, and we'll hook into that to call a handleMapClick method. Then, let's create that method in our app.js file, and it will have a single argument, e, which is the passed-in event from the map. When the map is clicked, we'll add a new placeholder restaurant to the end of the restaurant's data array. And using that e argument, pull in the latitude and longitude of the point that was clicked on using the lat and lng methods shown. Now if we save, refresh the browser, and click somewhere on the map, a new pin is created. We can click on this pin and see an info window with the hard-coded attributes that we attach to it. We can also add as many pins as we want. Of course, as soon as we refresh, these will be gone. But you can always use this method to do something like make a request to the API and pass through the location data from the map's click event. And that's all there is for this video. You've learned how to create, embed, and populate a Google Map with Vue, using our Laravel-powered API, We've retrieved items from a database, plotted their locations using map pins, and displayed their details in pop-up info windows. As always, if you have any questions or comments about this video or any other web development topics, please feel free to reach out to me in the comments or on my Twitter linked below. Huge thanks to my GitHub sponsors, as well as everyone else who continues to support these videos. Thanks for watching.